problem in many developing countries is not that gender issues and sex crimes are not codified as illegal in the penal code or through formal legislation. The problem is that they are systematically under-enforced by judges who have wide legal autonomy, by police officers who don't care enough to follow up on calls, and by parole boards who believe that sex crimes can be easily rehabilitated and are not as severe. We think a legalistic stance is necessary to address all these problems, and the feminist movement is best placed to engage in this type of advocacy. What is our stance? Firstly, feminist movements in developing countries should prioritize advocating for carceral feminism above and beyond stuff like reforming the legal code, public shaming of offenders, calling out campaigns, and so on. This means that we advocate for the mandatory use of jail terms for crimes like molest, like non-aggravated sexual assault, which in many legal codes are punishable only by a fine and not even by jail terms. And also we support drastically campaigning for the increase in the jail term for severe sexual crimes like rape. What is our stance? We're going to have 3 arguments. Firstly, that this is a requirement of justice. Secondly, that this reduces gender and sexual violence. Finally, that this helps the feminist movement in terms of their organization. Firstly, that this is a requirement of justice. We think that higher sentences are required, and it is the obligation of the feminist movement to advocate for these higher sentences. Why is that the case? Firstly, there is a retributive aspect. We think that many people have strong moral intuitions that we should have retribution against crimes of passion, especially when people are culpable and when they have agency to decide whether or not they want to commit these crimes. Especially when these crimes involve degrading the dignity of other people and using them as a means to an end. Even if we say that in these societies there are strong conservative social pressures, the fact is that the vast majority of men choose not to commit these crimes, and there's a huge, therefore, element of individual culpability. We think that we owe it to the victims of this movement to engage in this type of retributive call for justice. Secondly, we think that it's uniquely victim-centric. Seeing your offender locked up is cathartic for victims. It allows them to feel safe walking the streets, or safer walking the streets at night. And we think that if the rest of this debate washes out, if the impact on future victims is uncertain and unclear, what we know for sure is that right now the feminist movement has failed the current victims of crimes, and we have a duty to advocate on their behalf for retribution against the people who have committed these crimes against them. So we protect the most vulnerable victims who have been failed by feminist movements and their advocates right now. But secondly, the practical stuff, that this reduces gender and sexual violence. Note that most conservative societies just don't by nature have codified long sentences or severe sentences for sex crimes yet. The reason is because penal codes in these countries were inherited often from colonial common law systems, which gave large autonomy to individual judges, and also gave came from a relic of a more conservative era in which these crimes were not punishable by mandatory sentences. Without advocacy, there is no organizing effort. We think that there are 2 scenarios. Firstly, that the vast majority of people in these countries believe that these offenders should be more harshly punished already, and therefore feminists are an important tipping point in terms of organizing this advocacy. We think that in this case it is incredibly important that we advocate for this, because the alternative, as often happens in many developing societies, is extrajudicial killings. For example, encounter killings in India. We think that this is bad, not just because there's no due process, but also because this leads to wider conservative backlash against women and the people who ask for this type of things. We think that if there's already this widespread wellspring of anger against sex offenders, we think that it's very important that the feminist movement engages in advocacy to seize on this, to try to use legal channels to repeal many of these arcane laws that don't adequately punish sex offenders. We think that moreover it's important because feminists can add a specific interest in their agenda, which is often more victim-centric to many of these movements. So why do we think that if in the case where we do manage to succeed in pushing through additional marginal legislation, this is beneficial? Firstly, we incapacitate criminals for longer. There are direct benefits to victims, as I discussed, and many of these offenders are enabled by the community and friend groups, so they are likely to be repeat offenders. Just taking them out of this picture for like 20 years is incredibly important. Secondly, this just leads to more enforcement. Firstly, because police officers are often rewarded based on the amount of time that the prosecutor has managed to sentence the cases that they refer to the prosecutor for. It helps them meet their KPIs, they are more likely to respond to phone calls and likely to enforce the law. More people are likely to volunteer to be community police officials or provide tips to law enforcement if they know the probability of a rapist being jailed rather than no action happening is likely to be higher. Also, as I mentioned, it reduces extrajudicial measures that are intended to target these individuals, meaning that it's important for purposes of due process and ensuring clearance of policies. Yes?
Clearly there's a massive analytical gap in this case, because this relies on the messaging that the feminist movement is promoting to be so powerful that society is willing to jump on a limb to start enforcing these laws you said.
So we think that, as I'll explain later, many of these societies are primed to actually adopt these laws. We think that this is a low activation, that this is a low threshold type of policy that we advocate for. And we think that it's incredibly important that we be able to seize on this now to create concrete legal change. Moreover, another benefit of concrete legal change is that it is norm-creating. That is to say that if we manage some kind of incremental change, it changes mindsets and makes it easier, for example, in a precedent-based legal system, to engage in more formal legal protections later on, because we think that laws also shape social norms and that kind of thing. Third, we think that there's more deterrence. People expect that they can get away often with committing sex crimes because the legal system doesn't enforce any kind of mandatory penalties. If there's a possibility that these sentences will be higher, if there's a mass movement in society that they're going to increase the sentences even if the law hasn't directly changed, I think this reduces the confidence in people's minds. And even though these are crimes of passion, we think that on the whole people still behave somewhat rationally. Finally, we think that there will be a greater, like if people are in prison for longer, there will be a greater push for advocacy for like rehabilitation of these offenders. Currently there's no, in a moment there's no push for this in these societies, so we think that on the fair there will be more rehabilitation. Yes.
You seem to believe that there's already widespread desire for this, but you want to additionally say that we want actively more punishment. Isn't this really an extra bloodthirsty narrative push?
Yes, sure. We think that this is, so firstly we think that this is important for victims, so even if it's perceived as more bloodthirsty, this is better. Secondly, many of the things that you would otherwise advocate for do seem quite retributive, right? The idea that there should be additional restrictions on individuals to stop them from, to stop future incidents of sex crimes. I just think that people who argue that the feminist movement is overly restrictive will do so on either side, and I can't really see a world where they advocate for something that can be skewed as somewhat restrictive for individuals. I find that this is good for the feminist movement as a whole. As I discussed, this is a lowest common denominator issue. In many conservative societies, people have strong intuitions that certain types of the most egregious sex crimes are wrong. This is driven perhaps by conservative ideas of protecting your kid and protecting your family. But what this means is that there's a low activation threshold to getting people to understand with and engage with the feminist movement under this specific type of advocacy. This means things like funding, but it also means things like protests that you organize. We have greater participation, and people can enter these protests, can participate, and learn more about other causes that the feminist movement stands for. This is a great example of this. It's like the marching and organizing that happened around the death of Nubaya in New Delhi, where essentially many of the people who participated in this, out of a feeling of outrage, then continued to fund or engage with the feminist movement further later on. As a consequence, we think this is good for the feminist movement as a whole. We're proud to propose.
I thank us here very much for those remarks, and this House is now pleased to recognize the leader of the opposition.
Is it okay if I speak like this? Two things before I get started. First, I want to shout out Yossi Moskovich, who's been instrumental to my development as a debater. Never got a shout out from me at previous tournaments. Now you have one. He made these things. Second thing I want to shout out, it's really great and an honor to be here, and I want to laud the community for, in the final, for recognizing a great diversity in terms of speaking styles and speakers here, notes or no notes. With that being said, that's what it is. Panel. The feminist movement is often a vehicle for the representation of vulnerable people in post-colonial and developing societies. We think that insofar as that is true, its priority ought to be to attract as much support and buy-in from the population as possible in order to ensure the maximum amount of good for the most people. We think that when we prioritize this form of advocacy over other issues, it is likely that it harms buy-in, while simultaneously being an extremely bloodthirsty and harmful narrative. Two claims from opening opposition in this debate. First, why the strategy that OG must pursue necessarily harms the feminist movement in achieving its goals, and second, why the counterfactual long-term bottom-up buy-in to deter gender-based violence happens better on our side when it happens organically, rather than mediated through the feminist movement. On framing, note that this is a debate about prioritization. So we think that in terms of time trade-offs, resource trade-offs, and so on are zero-sum in many cases. We propose directing resources towards other tangible impacts. That is not to say we ignore victims of sexual violence. We look at this looks like providing services to domestic violence shelters and things like this. It's like helping them with resources and informational evidence. It looks like advocating for feminist spaces where we can discuss and talk about these kinds of things. All of these things are things that feminist and gender-based movements do in developing the world in the status quo. We think they're likely to prioritize doing those things over the other. In terms of the specific trade-off with the rhetoric, rather than advocating for harsher punishments, which I think XK already observed in a POI is likely to lead to a degree of backlash due to its bloodthirstiness, I think it's probably the case we're going to focus on generally attempting to foment change in society in alignment with the feminist discourse. And I just don't think the problem OG imagines is likely to accrue, right? Insofar as most nations have laws on the books concerning sexual misconduct, I just question the degree to which the extremity of the narrative is necessary. What does this message then likely look like? It looks like on their side, pushing for more and far stringent punishment for gender-based misconduct, noting that already in the status quo, most developing states, despite them being colonialist, have laws on the books to prevent things like rape and things like this, and are already legal. Insofar as that's true, we think we can still talk about these things situationally. So in the context they want to talk about, where it's a low-threshold narrative, we can get buy-in by talking about these things situationally and in context where it matters. So it's not that we're silencing those issues, it's not like there's backlash and extrajudicial killings and all of those things. What is our counterfactual? Our counterfactual is pretty clearly the prioritization of less controversial narratives for fairly obvious reasons. Insofar as the feminist movement doesn't want to alienate potential donors, local individuals, and things like that, they're likely to move toward the median in terms of promotion and other forms of advocacy. The two extraneous responses I want to forward to OG before getting into constructive are twofold. The first is there's a massive analytical gap in their case. They never explain why it's the case that the feminist movement talking about these things leads to the impacts they're talking about. The reason it won't is twofold. First, the feminist movement has limited political capital relative to religions and other networks that have significantly more asymmetries of power. Insofar as there's already a distrust against the feminist movement in many circles, because it's seen as a Western imposition or mediated through the West, there is likely to be significant and sustained backlash to the feminist movement in general, which precludes these kinds of things. But secondly, insofar as there is likely to be an extreme amount of general difficulty in conveying this narrative, right, in terms of making it noticeable, in terms of grabbing the attention of broader society, it necessarily means there's a race to the bottom in terms of the kinds of narratives they protect, right? That is to say it's likely to be extreme in nature rather than inextreme in nature, because they're competing for airtime among other forms of organization. The comparative on our side is we're proffering other forms of narratives rather than this one. It's likely you get you don't have to A, compete for airspace with these other narratives, but B, you're likely able to target to your own population that already buys in explicitly, or insofar as you're targeting with other people, it's probably tastes better. So I think that's pretty clear. The second thing I want to talk about then, and the first thing I want to forward, is that carceral feminism harms buy-in to feminist movements. The reason this is important is because the feminist movement is often the only recourse for vulnerable people. Insofar as, in many contexts, as Arthur points out, it's likely that there are some lacunae in the laws of developing states that vulnerable people are unable to take advantage of. And I want to be very nuanced here. Often developing nations, there are a number of politicians and other groups of people with power who are quite regressive in their approach to gender-based issues, or are not as progressive as the feminist movement led. There are reasons why this is true. Arthur observes some of them: the legacy of colonialism, strong men in power because of Western things like this, and the role of religion being more pronounced in developing nations generally, often because of colonialism as well. I think this seeps into every vernacular, and it's something that's quite bad for the feminist movement. So when they message that we want to put people in jail far longer, we ought to go after men and target them, not only for things that are already criminal, that is, rape and sexual assault, but also for less extreme but still harmful crimes. It is likely to cause a significantly greater and more sustained direct backlash to the feminist movement. Before I go on and unpack that, I'll take a few other closing.
You have a choice. Either these things are already punished, in which case it's not clear why people object to you punishing them a bit more, or they're not, in which case we get a lot of change if we are able to provide some.
In the context where it's already punished, it's likely to be seen as unnecessarily bloodthirsty and alienating, insofar as you're likely to continually criminalize less and less severe things in order to gain traction, or advocate for the criminalization of more and more less and less severe things in order to gain attention and airtime and things like this. If it is the case that there is a wide degree of change, I've already explained why it's unlikely to get a degree of buy-in from that.
Sure, do you support stuff like call-outs or the public shaming of rapists who are always for free?
Probably not if it leads to massive backlash against those victims because we want to prioritize their safety. What happens then? I think the first thing you do is it makes you far harder for the feminist movement to win over people like politicians and positions of power. This is critical in terms of both negotiations and coalition governments where the feminist movement has limited political sway, and often the degree and the position on these specific issues, and I mean, so far as it harms their electorate, are the difference between gathering support for those people and alienating them entirely. So on context where the feminist movement holds some degree of power, you marginalize and minimize the ability for feminist political parties in India to gain the kind of advocacy that they want to talk about. But secondly, you make it far, far harder for local donors and other individuals to be associated with the feminist movement to the same degree. Insofar as it is the case that they likely want to be associated with the extremist narrative, which is necessarily the characterization that their narrative has to defend in many instances, it's like they pull out that kind of funding. You get less money for things like domestic violence shelters, you get less money for things like support for victims of the crimes that they are so concerned about talking about, and you get less support for educational initiatives that target men and tell them this is not the way, do things different. Why is this a tipping point? Because as I've observed, the feminist movement probably might be subject to a degree of backlash on either side. The difference is, they see this on their side as literally having the potential to put men's bodies and power in jail imminently. Insofar as this puts bodies on the line to a degree that no other advocacy of the feminist movement is likely to advocate does, when it becomes central to their messaging and the prioritization that they forward above all else, it is likely that there is a significant backlash against the movement. What is the impact of this? I think the first impact is, just in terms of time, it often trades off against other forms of advocacy. Insofar as this advocacy is better on our side, because there's likely more widespread political capital for women in education, for example, because you center that in your messaging, there's more widespread buy-in from other elements of society, it's probably the case that we get more support for that kind of thing. But furthermore, I think you harm buy-in from women, right? Because often the landscape of gender relations is very, very complicated and nuanced. What I mean by this is that in many instances, women are averse to seeing men in their family who might be badly behaved by the standards of the feminist movement being punished or susceptible to being punished. What this does is it removes their faith in the feminist movement to a significantly greater degree. This means, on balance, when they see feminist messaging, they're more likely to opt out of selecting into things like domestic violence shelters or protections or women's discussion groups or all these benefits that we can accrue on our side of the house. The final claim I want to make is over the long term, we likely get more buy-in to deter gender-based violence. Insofar as globalization and more interaction with different people from different backgrounds is likely to occur and migration is on the rise and so on and so forth, it's likely to get a heterogenization of society over time either way. Insofar as it happens organically, it's far less likely to lead to the same degree of backlash that they're talking about, rather than to an imposed by feminist leaders in a homogenized and unnuanced way. Because we're better for society, better for the nation, and better for the world, we cleanly take this debate, and I couldn't be more fucking proud to stand in opening opposition to one very, very last.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and get the sun out. I thank you for those remarks. This House is now very pleased to recognize the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can you hear me? Over 80% of women in South Asia claim to have faced sexual harassment. 1 in 6 women in South America claim to have faced sexual assault. The reality is that this is an existential crisis of safety faced by half of the world's population. What we needed from an opposition was a comparative that meaningfully addressed this problem beyond providing men who believe, according to them, that the feminist movement is a Western imposition, beyond giving them education, beyond setting up shelters that women do not know whether they can trust because the movement will not advocate for punishing their assailants who denied them dignity. I want to talk about 3 different things in this speech. First, I want to talk about addressing gender violence. Second, I want to talk about building the feminist movement in these countries more broadly. And third, I want to talk about justice, because claims of justice have been criminally under-addressed in Matt's last speech. First, let's talk about addressing gender violence. And gender violence and addressing it is the prerequisite to building the movement as opening opposition wants. Why is this the case? The first reason is because safety is an everyday threat faced by women. In order to build a meaningful feminist movement, you need women joining your movement. You need them to organize for you because you cannot rely on men in the country, and that requires them feeling safe as individuals. The second reason is because you need to address the everyday threat faced by women for you to have credibility as a movement. For people people to trust that you are there for them and their protection, not just in offering a shelter, but in placing the responsibility where it lies. The first claim from them is that feminist movements simply have limited political capital and will not get this change on the books. They offer us two mechanisms here. First, they say you face competing pressure from religion and other networks, and that creates backlash, especially since men in particular do not want to feel punished. I have a number of responses here. The first is that religions and other networks in these countries often do preach justice. The problem is not their willingness to prosecute these individuals, but rather the fact that these religions haven't formed an organizing force. In the absence of women turning out to vote to hold politicians accountable, or in the absence of feminist rallies, the problem in these countries is not that people actively don't want men to be punished, but rather you don't have the political capital because they have a range of other issues that they need to care about and they need to push these governments on. So what we get from feminist organizations is we get access to the religions that preach justice in these communities. This is compounded by the fact that, as Arthur told you, in these communities you often have patriarchal norms, like for example, women belonging to the family or the purity of women. These norms are awful, but we can weaponize these norms because that also means these communities are often concerned with preventing violence against women. And being capable of weaponizing these norms in our favor is a strategy that feminist activism can take. The second response, though, is Arthur also explains why this is a low threshold form of activism. And this engages with their claim that this is seen as way more bloodthirsty. I think there are three responses to this claim that is just bloodthirsty and therefore rejected. One, it is more likely that you have active organization among feminists than active non-organization outside the feminist movement. The reason why is because women face an existential threat to their safety and therefore are far more likely to turn out to something like organizing protests, because anger is a really powerful and important galvanizing force. That's why after the sexual assault and murder of Nirbhaya in Delhi in 2012, you saw one of the most widespread feminist organizations in India, where women who didn't identify as feminists turned out and marched because they knew their safety was at stake. Their response to this is to say that women are often averse to men and their families, for example, being punished. But I don't think this response meaningfully engages with the claim, because often these processes center women's autonomy. To have a criminal case, you need a woman to press charges, you need a victim to testify in court. This means women understand that they have access to the autonomy in these cases and are therefore able to turn out and organize. The second is these countries often have cultures of being tough on crime. The fact that police and military institutions often keep governments in developing countries in power means they have strong cultures of believing that being tough on crime is important. The problem is that crimes have often been systematically sidelined when they come to women. And this is where we engage with their claim you already have laws on the books. The problem is their situational approach, and I'm literally quoting Matt here, is precisely the approach that empowers individual judges to make decisions based on the circumstances of an individual perpetrator, rather than having broader public attention to what that perpetrator, no thank you, is actually doing. The third thing they say is that there is a race to the bottom, that you're simply competing for airtime and therefore will go more and more brutal. Two responses. One, you get more airspace with more people buying in. If you go more and more brutal, there are fewer people turning out to your protests. That means your media is not getting attention. Second, media organizations often cover what people want to hear. So if a feminist organization is existing and gets a lot of airtime, that gets a lot of attention, that's when airtime occurs. Critically, this is airtime they don't get for their alternatives like shelters, because something like an explicit sexual assault has often made headline news in these countries, and feminists are uniquely able to exploit this attention in order to push for the changes that they meaningfully want. The final thing is, in many cases, men themselves are more likely to object to their alternatives than our policy. Why? Because things like targeted education at men, or education more broadly to teach men to move past their gender norms, is applying culpability to every single man rather than the individual man who is the perpetrator of this crime. And that is a critical margin that means men are also likely to support this feminist activism on our side. Before I move on, closing.
In countries where women are already infantilized and trapped under the guise of protecting them, the last thing we need is another narrative that paints them as victims who need saving.
But the narrative that paints them as victims who need saving already exists. All we're doing is ensuring that we're actually able to save real victims.
At best, your impact is some more people get end up in prison in the short term and maybe more buy-in occurs in the feminist movement. We can get buy-in symmetrically via other means, and the backlash that necessarily accrues to those few more people being put in prison overeats your gain. So you get a few years gain and then 10 steps back a few years.
Yeah, I just explained why you're unlikely to face this kind of significant backlash, so I think you should listen to my speech. But here's why I'm going to explain why this makes a critical juncture of difference. There are two different scenarios. One, these countries have insufficient sentences, in which case, as Arthur explains, police officers engage in extrajudicial killings and extrajudicial punishments like encounter killings in India because they feel the need to act in this manner, what that results in is far more backlash. Second, we empower police response. Even if the sentence itself doesn't work, slightly higher sentences means police departments are more likely to listen to the calls that survivors make, more likely to respond, more likely to prevent gender violence from occurring. Third, incarceration often is important. First, because we get access to rehabilitation. Without a longer sentence, you don't have the political capital to make investments in rehabilitation, to make prison spaces that actually rehabilitate criminals. But second, we incapacitate them. We deter people from committing crimes when you know you can't get away scot-free because you know the judge that there's a mandatory minimum sentence on the books. Finally, given we build a stronger feminist movement and we reduce these crimes from occurring, I want to be clear. Even if none of this is true, we have an obligation primarily to people who've already been victims. They deserve justice. If you vote on nothing else, vote on that justice. Propose.
I thank you very much for those remarks, and this House is now pleased to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I've done shout-outs before, people really know that they're important and all of that. I'll just say one thing very quickly. I started debates watching HWS round-robin videos, always getting intimidated, you know, being like, oh, how could they make these arguments, you know. But it's nice to be on that stage making, hopefully, those same arguments that people find persuasive. So, kids, if you're watching this round-robin, this can be you too. Great. Everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. It is during the most dire circumstances that the most radical ideas become the most seductive. Do not be fooled by the lust of rage you hear from OG. Judge through reason. First thing I'm going to do is explain why there is no impact on deterrence. I want to frame why this rebuttal is important. The crux of their impact and the very framing we get from DPM say that this is necessary to build the movement, limiting the amount of people that you would otherwise put in prison. If I substantially prove to you that this will likely have no delta on any sort of people not committing these crimes at all, then the premise of all of their positive impacts fall out. Now, to evaluate deterrence, you must address the cost-benefit calculus of the person committing the crime. There are 3 possible calculations that exist for a potential criminal. 1, they don't care if they get caught, they believe it's central to their religion or ideology, and therefore there's no impact. That is, say, or immediate crimes of passion where there's no time to think about the consequence. Obviously, there's no delta in these circumstances because they would never care about the crime that would otherwise be imposed upon them. They care about the afterlife substantially more. Second scenario, they measure to some degree the ability to not be punished and not get caught. Obviously, there's no delta in these scenarios because their calculus operates on getting caught, not the degree of punishment which is removed, but the potential that could otherwise exist. Insofar as the kinds of policies that they talk about do not necessarily address whether or not you are likely to get caught, there's no delta there. But thirdly, or where there's probably the most delta scenario for them, they measure to some degree whether or not they get caught, but maybe it's also a tipping point for them how large the punishment is. 30 years versus 5 years, etc. Why is there no meaningful delta in this third scenario? 1, people cannot really quantify the difference between 20 and 40 because it's reached a tipping point of direct harm to them. You're gonna lose your job, your family, you might get killed in prison, isolation, bad food, you might not be able to debate anymore. This exists whether it's 5 or 30 years. Secondarily, you cannot quantify the differences of an experience you've never had. They haven't been in prison, otherwise they wouldn't be free to commit the crime. So they don't have a metric to use for how bad an additional 10 years is. Thirdly, that is the third reason logically follows the calculus of whether or not they get caught. Now, OG might say, but there are some policies that we can otherwise push for, i.e. the institutionalism of judges, making sure they do their job, which would then affect the second and third calculus. This is the response that I have here. If the question is institutional change is necessary, but not the direct letter of the law, this movement is then duplicative. There are firstly leftist groups that exist in society that directly push for them, liberalizing groups saying we must democratize. Secondarily, foreign and domestic NGOs, that is their job that they've invested millions of dollars from charity donations to. Thirdly, foreign governments trying to democratize and enhance these institutions that make sure they follow all crimes regardless of who they affect. And fourthly, the organic material that Matt told you about, that the society is liberalizing over time, there's migration, etc. So in other words, all metrics for why an individual would commit crime are either not affected by their decision based on this movement, or if they are being pushed by different actors and external forces in society. The upshot of this is they don't get their actual change, and it's substantially unlikely that their premise is fulfilled. I'll take a few after that before we move back.
There are a range of alternative methods we can use to reduce crime. Incapacitation, improved rehabilitation, police response to prevent these crimes from happening, and building a meaningful movement by creating trust in the feminist movement. Deterrence was not our only option.
Your deterrence is contingent upon the institutional changes that we've talked about. Note that the alternatives that I've mentioned and the external groups push for all of those same methods and all of those same policies that incorporate all of the issues that they talk about. But if it's the letter of the law, I've explained why it's not going to win. Now, let's say you don't buy that. This debate is about mobilization and larger societal changes. There are two framings. One, that there are high barriers of entry that Matt told you about, so they're going to get backlash. Or OGs, that people really buy into this, but this feminist movement is a tipping point to getting people to buy in. If this is true, then it means the feminist movement, it's unclear why they need to mobilize for it, because most people would otherwise agree that sexual assault should be illegal. But let's say that they don't buy in. Then the issue for why they would disagree isn't the crime itself, but the reasoning for the crime. Sexual assault should be illegal, but it's fine if it's against, infidel women that are not following their religion. At that point, the issue isn't whether they buy into sexual assault, but far more entrenched, deep-rooted barriers of entry that Matt told you about that are far more persuasive. But thirdly, if it's cops being rewarded and need to provide an impetus for them to do their job, they would get the reward on either side because they can see that the legal punishments exist on either side. So then there's no delta on the person arresting them insofar as they can capitalize and increase their numbers because they can say, look, I arrested someone, by definition it's illegal, promote me on that. So all of their mechanisms for the sources that would otherwise compel people to arrest people does not exist. Now, DPM has a few responses. That they say you just need an organizing force. They say that people largely agree, you just need something to mobilize or coalesce the religious institutions. But note that it's unclear why the feminist movement must be the one to organize or all of these religious institutions or be the tipping point organizing force, insofar as the alternatives I mentioned already exist. But what is the upshot of the way? It means there's a direct trade-off to other important strategies that by definition you lose out on. Why is there a trade-off? Firstly, resources for lobbying. Secondly, general time. Thirdly, a limited media arena. And fourthly, mobilizing people using different issues across the feminist spectrum that galvanize their personal experience. Why does this matter? These are direct trade-offs to avenues where they aren't winning the battle already for a battle that they say that they're already winning on or about to win on. Because people agree that sexual assault should be illegal. That it's very wrong that people get away with it scot-free and violate our criminal justice system. So they're already winning the battle. I don't know why they need to send more troops to win that battle compared to another one. But there's a far more important trade-off that I'll explain to you from back first.
But most of your rebuttal is premised on the fact that they can't win, in which case it seems like an eminently reasonable fight to divert resources.
No. We engaged in both scenarios. We explained why it's likely that they can't win, but if you don't buy that characterization and it's one in which people largely agree, then it doesn't make sense why you need to expend your resources there as opposed to other battles that you could otherwise win. But here's the second more important trade-off. You make the conversation about punishing the individual and not that it's a societal issue that must be tackled. How locker room talk triggers this. How boys will be boys narratives allows them to feel like they can do what they want. This ignores the root cause and discussion of policies to push to fix the problem at its source. Schooling and educational programs that I tell you about, consent ed in universities. Things that actually create deterrence from the onset, as opposed to hoping you catch someone. Maybe you don't, maybe you do. I've explained why it's unlikely that you do, and there's no tipping point there. The weighing here is, at best, they say maybe a few more people go to jail, but the crime has been committed. Compared to on our side, we address the trade-offs of societal issues that make sure the crimes don't happen in the first place, but are so structural and foundational to the narratives that they're trying to pushing for a change that affect how every single man will adjudicate and act based on the narratives that they consume. Look, I know that AG and other teams will probably give you very flowery rhetoric. Judge based on reason. Don't waste your troops on a battle you are already winning, or that it's unlikely you can win based on that. Kids, I hope you're happy.
I thank you very much for those remarks. Welcome the member of government.
emotionally, I could not agree more with top half in terms of the severity of the issue that needs to be resolved. But they do make a fatal flaw, which is that by and large, the most serious crimes that we're talking about are already largely punished. And OO is right to point out that 10 versus 40 years in jail probably does not matter for the safety of these women. The question then is, are they successful in changing harassment law, which even in France is relatively unpopular because people think it's flirting? And though we wish they could, the answer is probably no, and for widening the definition of what constitutes gendered violence, it is unlikely the political capital exists. So while I think OG is correct to identify the problem, I don't think they prove we actually help that many more women, because it's either so easy that we probably don't need to help or it's already happened, or so difficult that they never prove why a feminist movement is likely to change. The problem with OO is they just don't really have an argument, right? Because they're like, why waste your energy on this thing that is either too easy or too difficult? Well, in some sense, like, any other thing could either be too easy or too difficult. Either everyone agrees with you that women should be paid the same as men, in which case, what's the point in advocating for it? Why don't we move elsewhere? Or they don't, in which case there's no point advocating for a thing that's difficult. So I actually just don't think they point to another thing they want to do. How are you actually able to change in any other avenue, except vaguely pointing to this thing called the bottom-up movement? That, you know, is a thing, but is not what I explained. What we want to do is say, what happens in the majority of these cases is there is some unfortunate act of violence against women, there is a massive swell of activity, and people will push for change. The feminist movement should be there on the front line. But what matters is not that at the end of it you change the number of years someone spends in jail, but that the feminist movement was on the front line, because then you are able to shape the conversation more going forward. And crucially, OG says you get more buy-in, but they never explain why that is instrumentally valuable for passing policies anywhere else. They merely say this is a place you can achieve change without tangibly identifying what you're likely to be able to do. So the first thing I want to talk about is what the different perception of the movement is likely to be under both sides of the house. The first thing is to deal with the opening opposition argument that you're likely to be perceived to be bloodthirsty. I want to say two things here. One, most men do not think they are bad people. Even though a lot of them do terrible things, no one ex ante is like, I am the person that's going to get drunk and do this horribly violent thing against this woman. So no one perceives themselves to be threatened by this policy because no one thinks that they would do this to themselves. In fact, secondly, most people think that this violence is a bad thing because paternalistically they have wives and daughters, or just because they happen to be a good person, or you happen to be living in a relatively bloodthirsty society. So I think you're likely to get a large amount of buy-in, as opening government noted, and my opening opposition is largely out of this round. Secondly, what is the comparative that any other policy would advocate for in the first instance? It's things like giving women equality or changing social structures in a way that is much more directly conflicting with men's interests. Because if I'm one of the boys, I like playing rugby, and people are like, your culture's a bit problematic or toxic, that is an affront to me because I'm much more likely to perceive that as conflicting with me versus violence, which I never think is actually likely to happen. So we're much more likely to get men on side and to believe that we're advocating versus any other policy. Secondly, on women, opening government, I think they are. Yeah, opening government. Said that the thing you need is for people to believe that they're advocating for you. Feasibly, this applies to almost anything that you could do, right? You don't really need to express sympathy, but advocate. The distinction here is merely that the vast majority of women do not agree with the most liberal tenets of the feminist movement, or at least a good number of them, right? My mother, who is a very quasi-liberal person, keeps saying things like, oh, but I struggle, I face much worse, why are people advocating for this nonsense? There's this internalization that the right way, though difficult, is sort of correct in what everyone has to go through, and that you're naive for believing that anything should be different. Or there's this belief that culture is important, and the more liberal tenets of your movement that you're likely to get in the alternative aren't things that cohere with what they look like. There's a ton of religious women who just believe that the existing society might be good, and their religious texts tell them that in some circumstances men should be lauded, who don't believe you under anything else. But violence is almost universally the difference. No one is sympathetic to the person that murdered a woman. That is why, crucially, you're able to get them on side. But secondly, here's the massive distinction versus opening government. They basically say a relatively popular movement could maybe say this violence is bad, and you can get a few more people on board. The question is actually the alternative. Imagine a feminist movement that is relatively silent when there is an upswelling of anger about the assault on a woman. That is when people say, you don't listen to us on the most basic things. Why don't we go to any other movement? Maybe the conservative movement that is very tough on crime, because they represent you on the most important thing. This is necessary to keeping women on side, as well as having the benefit of appealing to the vast majority of women. Yes?
Your own framing says this debate is about harassment law and second-order crimes. Insofar as that is true, the change in messaging on Gov is very minimal, and we can use a different, less polarizing narrative to attract membership.
What we think you should do is get in front of the movement that says this was horrible, advocate for a change in law for 10 to 40 years, and then you are a legit movement that people care about that allows you to do stuff. It has nothing to do with harassment law, which we think is good but should not be a priority of the feminist movement. What is the benefit of just taking advantage of this to becoming a better movement? The first is that subsequently you are able to change people's perceptions on more moderate things. Partially because they listen to you for a bit longer, but more relevantly, right, people just listen to the people they already agree with, or they tolerate their policies. If I'm a Republican, I'm far more likely to hear Trump speak and be like, yeah, that seems okay, even though Obama said the same thing 4 years previously. So merely by persuading them, by having your central issue, it becomes much easier to persuade them on all of the other issues that they want to talk about. Secondly, political action becomes way bigger when once in one election you had tens of thousands of women voting for you. Firstly, because if you're a political party, you can have this one central thing that entices people to vote for you, and then a bunch of other policies that they say, these aren't necessarily things that I wanted, but because you're the feminist party, I will vote for these other things like labor laws subsequently. But thirdly, if you have a centralized feminist organization, it becomes much easier for political parties to do the thing they should have done all along. If women are 51% of the electorate, you should appeal to them. But if they have no one to speak to directly, to listen to what the most salient issues are for women, the ones that are most likely to swing them to vote for them, that's very difficult to do. But when you can credibly point to tens of thousands of people that turned up on the streets, and you say we organize and we can negotiate with you, the Liberal Party, they're far more likely to represent you. But thirdly, when people who were on the margins now come forward and say, sure, I agree with you, you say something that really matters to me, you can give them advice in a way that doesn't engender backlash, like, here's how you can negotiate for additional pay. But if they never felt it was important enough to turn out, or they distrust you because you didn't advocate for their safety, you're not likely to be able to get those benefits. So if you believe that change happens, you need to get people on side. Proud to propose.
I thank our speaker for those remarks. This House now pleased to welcome to the podium the member of opposition.
While it's true that I can't compete with Greg's charisma, I can fill a more important gap in the debate, which is that no teams have really engaged in the probable case of either side. We're going to do that in closing opposition, explain, okay, fine, let's give government their best case. Maybe it is the case that these things get adopted, maybe it is the case that you get longer sentences, and why that ends up leading to far worse and problematic enforcement that damages women in the developing world and does not actually need to change them. So we'll take the best and we'll prove why it doesn't work. Before that, I want to deal with the CG case and just point out that it lacks a huge degree of specificity for any of their material to flow. The first thing is, on their comparative, I just think the comparative they impose on us is false, which is to say that the feminist movement is burdened with exclusively narratively supporting things like just gender equality generically. But I think there's so many other things you can do, right? The expansion of domestic abuse shelters, support groups for women that are victims of these things, and more than that, it's unclear why this specific narrative needs to be taken in order for them to get any of the benefits. Most importantly, this occurs in the case where feminist movements want to get ahead of the movement. What could you say when there's a violent action that is committed that would co-opt all of their benefits? You can say, violence against women is incredibly bad and we do not support that. Notice how that fills in all of the problems that CG has identified simply by saying that this is a horrible thing and we stand against this and we ought to change society as a result. So that doesn't require any of their material to work, it just allows all of opposition to flow instead. So, with that said, let's move on to the extension. We'll provide the addition and engage in government's best case where this advocacy genuinely is successful at creating longer prison sentences and successfully achieves punishments for aggressors. So we think this leads to problematic enforcement and damages women in the developing world. The first thing to say is that except in government, there are liberalizing trends in many developing countries, which is to say they aren't politically uniform. So that suggests that there are liberal areas like New Delhi, for example, that might be more receptive to this policy. But more than that, in these areas, men are probably already getting punished at some level for the crimes that they have committed because they have relatively functional police systems and they have relatively functional laws. This is good because the education systems are probably working here, and it is likely that this leads to long-run change. But there are other areas where some of this crime does exist and where it does go unpunished in the status quo. We think huge harms begin to emerge that mean two things. One, we think it means you activate hatred against women, and two, we think that you fail to actually decrease crime, only radicalizing people further. Why does this happen? Accepting that they begin to be caught by government's mechanism, this is where harms develop. First of all, we think that these harms look like increasing the abuse to silence victims because you're worried of them turning to police and actually being able to turn to them in the first place. So you end up using further abuse in order to intimidate and scare people around you. Second, it looks like male police officers laughing at you and harassing you in interrogations. Even if they are receptive to these crimes being reported in the first instance, it actually means that you just don't get support within the system that might otherwise be attentive and receptive to these concerns. Third, it also looks like the formation of political parties which add anti-feminist rhetoric to co-opt these areas. To the extent that there are excessive levels of enforcement, this means that people end up being able to organize and mobilize around the fact that they feel like women are against them. And this isn't necessary right now. As a politician, you have nothing to gain from villainizing feminists in order to get elected, because that simply isn't something that is salient enough in society to lead to these sets of political changes. But to the extent that you add this narrative and add the support from the feminist movement, we think that this becomes politically opportunistic for politicians and for people in this area to actually win support. So these suddenly become political issues that are being discussed and are being used to demean political women in politics or women in society through the political force. Why wouldn't this happen right now, then, is the question. The first thing is, there isn't strong hatred that is cross-cutting in society in the way that proposition allows for. So when you break families apart, for example, and deny them of their breadwinners, people begin to feel incredibly angry. When somebody's friend ends up getting rushed off to prison, even if you individually don't feel like you are a bad person, you end up associating the feminist movement with the fact that you've lost this person. And this creates hatred where it otherwise wasn't as strong and otherwise wasn't targeted against the feminist movement in particular. Second, there isn't a perception in the status quo that the feminist movement actually wants to hurt men. Things like saying domestic abuse shelters are really important, or we should be able to provide services to women who have been victims of these things so they can find support and they can access therapy, are not things that fundamentally stand opposed and villainize men or threaten them with increased prison sentences. This changes that perception, and that's important. But third, even vigilante justice doesn't solve in these cases, as Proc suggests, because there are incredibly high costs to joining groups like the Blue Lobby Gang, so you end up having incredibly low reach. Furthermore, we don't think these punishments actually reduce crime. Before that, though,
any of your alternatives depend on first proposition's characterization of feminist organizations as being seen as Western impositions that are fundamentally constructed, not being true. Given that characterization of feminist organizations, we need something that is able to mobilize women using anger, and we do that.
I'm kind of unclear on that. Like, I think that all of this engages in the case where women generically have systems of support per the liberalizing trends that we and you identify, and then this activates a further anti-women stance in the areas where this currently isn't able to be activated. So I'm just not sure what you're getting at there. Okay, why does these punishments actually reduce crime? One, people struggle to probabilistically weigh the likelihood of a sentence affecting them because these crimes are related to irrational beliefs. So to the extent that in a moment of anger or in drunkenness, you end up abusing someone, these are things that don't factor into your cost-benefit analysis and don't actually influence the decision to do these things in the first place. But second, people do not feel that they are being fairly punished, so they don't buy into the rehabilitative process. Prisons are not good in the developing world. They often put you in places around other radical people. So you end up getting radicalized. I'll take closing.
You say that misogynists are likely to see this policy, respond actively to it, and therefore backlash. But they're not likely to see this policy and think they might get punished and therefore increase the likelihood that they...
Yeah, because it's related to a different unit of time, right? So it's the fact that you break families apart and then after the fact you get angry. Or it's related to the fact that you see people being taken away from your friend groups or from around you, and then that ends up activating that. It's not in reaction to the policy explicitly at that individual moment, but it's in reaction to the harms that end up being caused. So the problem is, this creates a narrative of state hatred. This is why proportionate punishments are so important, for example. An analogy is drug sentences leading to more crime being committed overall because of the feeling that the state is failing by over-imposing prison sentences. Third, longer prison sentences are just bad for society. Poor families are torn apart, and this creates substantial cycles of violence. And when narratively this is associated with the feminist movement, this often leads to it being targeted against the feminist movement and women in particular. What is the way here? First, right now, the feminist movement is able to get some change in liberal areas, and this begins to trickle down as legislative precedent gets set for more liberal regions like New Delhi. But we can't already have this as well on our side. The problem that they face is A, the cost of activation of hatred is incredibly massive. So this makes it much harder for women in these regions. But second, you make people more anti-women overall by putting them in prison where they're not actually being meaningfully rehabilitated, sending them back into society where these radical views end up leading to more violence and leading to more harm to women overall. On these grounds,
Thank you, Speaker, very much for those remarks. And this House is now open to the final speaker on the governor's bench, the governor's whip.
A controversial thing to say from government, but I actually don't give a shit about prison sentences. What I care about is anger. That is what motivates people to join the feminist movement in the first place. All op-bench is actually about, like, if they're going to do all these other things, like volunteer at a domestic shelter or fund the feminist movement. But I don't know why I'm going to do that. I'm living my life, I'm going day to day, doing what I want. The fact is that, like, sexism at your job is a little annoying. I'm not going to waste time out of my day to go protest it. But when I can't leave my house after 8 p.m. because I fear violence on the streets, because I fear being raped, that is what makes me angry. When I see a body in the street, when I see photos of this blasted on the internet, that is what motivates me to show up, to start donating. This is why in instances of violence you see large amounts of donations. When we see videos of violence, that is when people actually show up. OG sort of says this, but only to the extent that they say, and then we can punish these people more, and that's great. That does not matter, and that's not the point of the case. Like, look, OJ said it's uncontroversial, OO said it's bloodthirsty. None of that matters. What the feminist movement is quite likely to do is capitalize on the existing rage and stand at the forefront saying the government is not doing enough. We are the only force that can do that. We are leading the movement. You get movement leaders out of this because someone is the person who starts the hashtag on Twitter, who literally stands at the protest line to be like, I'm going to be holding this, yelling, leading the sign, and that means they are able to do this sufficiently more. They just say this like as an example of what happened in India, but suggest to criminalize rape a little bit more. I don't think that matters. But I think it actually changes the ability to build a political movement, and that is going to be much more topic. But let's say a visceral topic that gets people motivated. What does this do as a result? I think you feel significantly more represented in politics. One, when you have a clear movement that has an organized person at the front, you have someone to negotiate with. You have someone to call us and say, this is actually the policies we want. Like, oftentimes, the politicians literally don't know. But not only do they not know, they don't know if they'll get votes for it. So when a feminist movement can say, I am running leader, I am out here on the streets protesting, and my movement will vote for you if you embrace this feminist politics, that actually happens. You get more women elected into politics because when they lead these movements, they actually get the platform to be able to stand forward. They are able to push back against bad bills. They are able to advocate for new bills, including, for example, funding domestic violence shelters, which often need the government funding to even get this in the first place. You often develop women's wings of parties, which to some extent exist in certain developing countries, but often aren't fully powerful. So when you make the feminist movement, that they are able to influence the mainstream parties as a result. You are able to have a centralized movement and you're able to do this. You have a social cause to advocate for and to do these things. The problem is with what all opposition is saying is these are just much less public things. You actually don't have buy-in. You don't have people showing up to do these types of things. And I think this is very harmful. I think you are likely to have significantly more buy-in from women, and that is good. But not only that, there are also just men who will actually also buy into the feminist movement as a result of this. I think this also comes up again from CO. I just don't think it's true, which is most men are actually not abusers. There's a small percentage of them. So even when they're being arrested, most people aren't going to have family members that are arrested and suddenly hate the feminist movement. But most people do hate abusers. Whereas the alternative potential positioning that you could lead a movement for is like, we want to change social norms, we want women to stop doing as much housework, that is the thing that makes people backlash against you, and that makes it really hard to get buy-ins from the mainstream parties. That means they're less likely to talk with you. But when they want to show, even a conservative party, a crackdown on violence, that's when they bring the feminist movement into even the most conservative party to say, we are supporting you on this issue. Okay, I'm going to do rebuttal to CO, and then I will take points. First, they say that you're going to victims are going to be suppressed because people are worried about being sentenced. One, this only happens if there's actually meaningful impacts. I think O tried to say that we're not going to change any laws, it's not a big deal. Two, I think people probably want to suppress people from telling them they're violent either way. But second, they just talk a lot about how this is going to lead to a lot of hatred of the feminist movement. I just think this is an insane characterization of the developing world that they literally just don't mind when people commit crimes. Like, we are talking about people who have literally been arrested for crimes. I mean, people do not do these things. The rate of murder is fairly low. It's not like everyone is like, yeah, I know a murderer. I don't think we're probably going to get things like harassment criminalized, so I don't think that matters. I will take a point from conclusion if they have one.
If you say violence against women is terrible, isn't it easier to do this without provoking any anger by not painting abusers in any sympathetic light whatsoever?
I actually don't understand the point. Can you say it again?
If you say violence against women is terrible, doesn't it make it easier to activate this type of political narrative without needing to paint men in a possibly sympathetic light by everything we talk about on that?
I don't know how you would possibly be sympathetic, because the types of things that spark protests are things that are so unsympathetic that they got every woman so angry. They often got men so angry that even they were finding it unacceptable, that they were willing to participate in the protest with you. So I actually don't know how you're possibly going to get that. This is yes, I think this might be true if you're talking about the kind of edge cases of Greg talks about, which is mild forms of harassment. Maybe people defend those people. I don't think they defend the types of people we're talking about, which makes the movement seem uncontroversial, but gives it that kind of spark that starts it off. Yes.
We also talk about gender violence viscerally and powerfully. Just the conversations and policies we push for are systemic to the cause of violence instead of attempting to be retributive after the fact. Your narrative has to alienate women and people in power, which is the only characterization about the narrative in this debate that we both gave.
No. The point is anger. Yes, intellectually, educating men would be great, but it doesn't make me want to march on the streets because one, I don't think it's going to be very successful and it's not going to work. But two, it doesn't cause the kind of thing that causes people to come out in the first place. I think it's just what we really need is people to coalesce, to advocate, to push for these policies. And when you're not doing that, when you're not having that visceral reaction to violence, you're unlikely to do it. So I think all of the policies that they're pushing for, which are nuanced, good policies, don't get trending on Twitter. They don't get every woman talking about it in their house, how angry they are that it is at all acceptable. And now there's finally a voice saying this is so unacceptable. And I think what we tell you, which I think weighs most heavily in the round, is how you actually turn this into a movement that can get other policy, that can get women elected into power, that to the extent women get appointed, they're now appointing judges, or they might even be appointed as judges themselves, so they can actually convict criminals in the first place rather than just giving them harsher sentences. That there's a way for someone to organize the feminist movement so they now have a much more powerful vote, because they literally just have a Twitter handle now that says, we are all going to get out and vote for this politician, or I'm going to call this other person running for office because they didn't support our movement on XYZ thing. This means that you actually get a movement that is able to change not just this one issue, but large amounts of issues all over. This is the spark that starts the movement and is able to actually make change that allows women to have a voice in politics, which is crucial for them to have the type of advocacy and type of support they need that allows them to feel like they are safe and supported. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and this House is now very pleased to welcome the final speaker of the debate, the opposition whip.
in developing countries. It is a profoundly complicated and intractable problem that Isaac and I frankly don't have the answers to. What our extension does provide, though, is a harm. The most direct and chilling harm that has been articulated in this debate so far. What Isaac shows you is the way in which different people across the country, which will be very, very different based on their income, based on their background, based on their religion, are going to react to the idea that the feminist movement wants to increase prison sentences. So, first of all, I do think that those slightly unreasonable in the way they characterize how there's a universal backlash. I think that Gov is correct when they say, in many cases, people are primed to respond to these kinds of narratives. Yeah, some liberal women especially are to latch onto it. They've already been exposed to the idea that it's really, really bad. They're primed, they're angry, they will respond. Crucially though, note that this is also a reason why all of the Gov analysis on why the narratives would fall flat. Because when you say people need to be angry, they need a spark, or this is perceived as a Western imposition, I'm going to change that, yes, you're going to be able to have people buy into it because of those things, but these people are liberals who don't need this additional pressure to buy you anyway. What you want to do is reach out to women or reach out to men as well, outside of the bubbles that we already have right now. The issue though is they aren't concerned because they don't because they think that there's a Western position. Crucially, they're afraid. You need to provide a sense of safety that they won't get punished and hurt if they tell people about their preference with regards to the feminist movement. So in this regard, I do think they get a benefit. The issue, though, is that it's also the case that their benefit is extremely small. And I think that this is an issue that OG suffers from especially, because they make a lot of claims about how, in order to sell their really big argument about sweeping change and how that's possible, they make claims about how there's already popular support, and how politicians and justices are just teetering, waiting for the first opportunity to pass this kind of policy. The issues, though, are twofold. The first is, it then becomes really, really difficult for the panel to weigh what exactly the change is with regards to this motion. But the second thing is, they just misidentified the problem in this case, right? So what OG tells you is that we want to, that there's currently an under-enforcement of existing laws, that the feminist movement ought to bring attention to this, and it will work because people already want to fix it. The issue, though, is that the problem is not a lack of attention. And the reason we know this is true is the exact examples that Tejas himself gives about the massive protests that have occurred in New Delhi, and that people are upset and angry when atrocities happen. The issue, rather, is that nothing happens in response to these protests, oftentimes with intractable issues such as a lack of funding to enforce these things and difficulty amending laws, because it isn't just up to the feminist movement or what liberals want, it's also up to entrenched authorities as well as governments. So for those reasons, I don't think they get very much solvency at all. On the other hand, though, I think that increasing anger, as Jane wants to do, in places that you don't already have a hold, is really, really dangerous. Because even if you want to protest and your father will shut you in the house, it's really, really bad then to stir it up and incite it in places where you are not strong, because it is just true that there are places where women are more vulnerable, where the feminism has much less traction and much less of a presence. And if you incite anger then, it is just that you're angry, it encourages more anger as well. Anger destroys the fragile shield that women in these places have to protect themselves. That is, that we are defenseless, that we need to be protected, that we don't deserve to be exploited by men, for example. Because what happens then is you incite anger against these Western-educated rich girls in the capital who are protesting and saying that men are awful, they want to be placed in jail for longer times. Oftentimes men who you identify with in these areas because you listen to their interviews, for example, and they're saying things you agree with. And then you take this anger and outrage out on the people who cannot fight back, the vulnerable women around you. Note, though, that this is the most important argument in the ground today, because even if one policeman sees this and reacts in this way, that translates to dozens of girls that he refuses to help, for example, whereas he would have done on our side, because he believes now that if he helps, he's cooperating with a movement that he fundamentally disagrees with and wants to fail. So for those reasons, I don't think it's wise to inflame anger. You achieve very little traction in the liberal centers where you already have support, but you incite much, much more violence and danger in places that you really need to help women in. I'll take opening.
This assumes the police department is responding now, but the liberalizing force that Isaac describes does not happen in a vacuum. It depends on mobilization, not just among liberal women, but women across different sections of society campaigning against sexual assaulters no one, not even religions, have sympathy for.
Frankly, this goes back to what I said earlier on, which is that anger might work for people who are in a position of strength, who believe in themselves and want to punish the accusers. But the women that you don't have right now are afraid. You cannot use anger to get to them because even if they act on the anger, they are hurt. I'll take closing.
This case relies on the messaging from the urban centres being so unpalatable to liberals that people will be against it. But for you to get millions of women on the streets in New Delhi, you can't be saying all men are evil. You have to say murderers should go to jail. I don't believe rural people hate that message.
I think Jane's response to our case, that is, that this policy isn't that extreme and doesn't change anything, is a choice, and a bad choice, because Greg says that these laws already exist in order to weigh against football, and that therefore the place you want to get the most change is harassment. And I think that the problem then is it's really, really easy to misconstrue the ideas that you ought to punish people for harassment, because then you say things such as, it's just boys being boys, or why can't she just take a compliment, for example? And at that point, you have these huge problems in which you have this separation and fragmentation between the liberal areas and the conservative ones. So I think for those reasons, Isaac explained to you why the backlash we get is so tangible and so harmful, i.e. it happens worse in the conservative areas who have no ability to mitigate against it. But he also tells you that in Gulf's best case of enforcement, that this translates to no benefit to these women, because you don't choose your parents, but what you do is you worsen poor communities. When fathers go to jail, for example, when people are paranoid and trust police officers less, that is an environment that is much, much more tense, more afraid, and more prone to lashing out as the women that they perceive to be the forces pushing this movement forward. For those reasons, I don't think that they create much change at all. Panel, I think it's pointless to speculate on what the trends and the sweeping changes in terms of narratives and beliefs are going to be in this debate. It honestly depends on a lot of different stuff. And this is one choice in the narrative, but there are lots of other things too. Isaac gives the most direct and unique impact, vote